All right. Hello and welcome from the Center on Global Energy Policy at the School of International Public Affairs of Columbia University. My name is Harry Verhoeven, affiliated with CGEP and with CIPA. And it's my pleasure to be here with all of you for the first event in a series of discussions we're going to be hosting on African perspectives on climate and climate politics. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome you here for this first session, which will focus particularly on African involvement in global climate negotiations and African climate priorities, very important and very pertinent in the road leading up, of course, to the COP meeting in Glasgow. Now, before we get into the heart of the matter here today, a few housekeeping announcements. As many of you will know and will have noticed, this meeting is being recorded. It is open to the public. It is being live streamed. Therefore, if you have any questions and you are connecting with us via Zoom, you can do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll go through these questions and try to put them to our different panelists here, and to try to get an answer to those comments or ideas or questions or suggestions that you may be willing to share with us here today. We're going to start this off in a fairly traditional way. That is to say, our speakers will first, for the first 7 or 10 minutes or so, make some opening statements, share some thoughts with you. I will then enter into a dialogue with them, conversation, ask them a few questions, and then again, we'll turn to your questions, your comments, your concerns, and put them to our panelists. I'm particularly delighted to be joined by a number of very esteemed voices from different parts of Africa. I'll introduce them in just a minute. We're still waiting for one panelist who hopefully will be able to join us very soon. To begin the discussions. That's Emily Masawa, but if she wouldn't be joining us immediately, perhaps she will do so later in the course of the event. So therefore, without perhaps further ado, let me say a few words briefly about some of our guests here with us today. Speaking first will be Pa Ousmane Jaju, who, as many of you will know, is a director at the Green Climate Fund. An initiative he'll be talking about a bit more in just a second. He brings a wealth of experience in climate negotiations for many years, having served both at a technical level in Department of Water Resources back home in the Gambia, place where he was also the Minister of the Environment, but he's also been someone who's worked particularly hard at the global multilateral level with the least developing countries group, of which he was the chair. So he comes at this with a very broad and very deep expertise on the subject matter. Other speaker we'll hear about in just a second is Kamisa Camara, who's from Mali, where she served as a foreign minister, as well as the chef de cabinet of the president of Mali. She's also done very important work with USIP, as well as with the National Endowment on Democracy. And she's currently at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where she's also a director, in this case, I think, for external affairs, if I'm not mistaken, and for Africa. She too will offer some of her impressions and reflections on the subject matter. And finally, of course, I'll introduce her in greater detail later, Emily Masawa, who I really hope will join us, as she's been involved in climate negotiations within Africa, as well as at the global level, for almost 30 years. And was, I think, the first chair, if I'm not mistaken, for the African Group of Negotiators, where the point people, of course, at many of these important global meetings for African interests. So I think, without further ado, we'll be making a start. So if I could ask my panelists perhaps also to turn on their cameras as we get this discussion going. And as I said, perhaps we will first turn to you, Pa. For your opening remarks, your reflections, and then we turn to you, Kamisa. So, Pa, without further ado, over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. And good morning from Sondo, South Korea, where the Green Climate Fund is based. As you stated, I am Pa Ousmane Jaju, served in the government of the Gambia, technically as a director and later as minister. But then during the course of my tenure as director, I became the lead negotiator for the Gambia, being the focal point for climate change, and later became the chair of the least developed countries in the negotiations leading to Copenhagen and post-Copenhagen and all the way to Paris. But in Paris, I led the LDCs as minister then at the political level, which was a very, it was the height of our achievement in terms of global climate change, where, of course, we all know that the global ambition for climate change was endorsed, and the Green Climate Fund also became operational immediately after that. So I am very pleased to join this panel and look forward to a very fruitful engagement. Thank you.
All right. Paddy, you want to maybe to hand the floor to Camisa also to say a few words, or do you would you like to continue perhaps with your substantive remarks, or how would you like to move forward?
Yes, I mean, in the climate change, we know Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents, which is highly impacted by the impacts of climate change. One, because of the capacity, both in terms of institutional and human capacity to the adverse effects of climate change. And it's also where you have almost 70% of least developed countries. And in the negotiations, Africa coming from a development perspective, we know it was underdeveloped, and it contributed almost less than 1% to the impacts of climate change. And as a member of the non-Annex 1 countries, as you know, during the beginning of the climate change negotiations, there was this differentiation between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. And it was agreed that Annex 1 countries who were historically responsible for the impacts of climate change were also tasked with providing resources, support both in terms of finance, capacity building, and technology to non-Annex 1 countries, which are basically developing countries. And as we move to during the negotiations, the African countries, particularly the least developed countries, which were the majority coming from Africa, established the least developed country group. And the first chair of the least developed countries was the late Mama, who came from Mali, very, very, very instrumental in the cause of climate change, and also a lead negotiator for Africa over the years. And as they formed the least developed country, they fought for special circumstances for least developed countries. And this led to a decision to support the least developed country program, which also led to the call for the formation of the least developed country fund, the LDCF, through which least developed countries were supported to implement national adaptation programs of action. This was very key because adaptation was the priority for Africa and also for least developed countries. In the negotiations, as we moved from the beginning of the 1992 all the way to 2005 in Montreal, there was this understanding and observation that emission reductions were not really coming to fruition, and there was this agreement among parties to form two working groups. One was called the Ad Hoc Committee on Long-Term Cooperative Action, and the other one was on the Kyoto Protocol. As you know, the Kyoto Protocol was also agreed, where developed countries were tasked to reduce their emissions drastically. But then that was not very effective, in the sense that the US did not agree to be a party to the protocol. So in essence, once we agreed on having these two track of negotiations looking at the long term, and also the commitment of parties to the Kyoto Protocol to see how everybody can come on board, and particularly the US. We moved on all the way to Bali, which coincided with the fourth assessment report that came out with a very stark scenario of the impacts of climate change, and that was where even Africa also was shown to be the most vulnerable continent, and the impacts of climate change would affect water resources, health, all the sectors, particularly when it comes to the most vulnerable. Now, in Bali, we agreed to have a balance in terms of action to address the impacts of climate change, which was called the Bali Action Plan. And in the Bali Action Plan, developing countries took some form of commitment through a nationally appropriate mitigation action that would be contingent on the support of finance, technology, and we also agreed on a framework, a measurable, reportable mechanism, an MRV, verifiable action. And here in the developing countries also agreed on targets that would be aligned with the IPCC report that called for emission reductions between 20 to 45% using 1990 as a baseline. We saw as part of that countries agreeing that by 2009 in Copenhagen, which was COP15, countries agreed to rally and reduce emissions that were in line with the IPCC report. And then we moved to Copenhagen, where I mean, a lot of momentum was built, rallied again across the globe. Both civil society, everybody was really geared towards Copenhagen, and we thought would have been the cornerstone of climate action. Now, unfortunately, in Copenhagen, we couldn't agree to a commitment, but what emerged was an accord that was negotiated by a few countries, but led by the new US president, then President Obama. And in there, they agreed on a fast-track finance. Fast-track finance of mobilizing $30 billion within 3 years, 2010 to 2012. And they also agreed to establish a green climate fund that would mobilize $100 billion per annum by 2020, which actually was a good start, but we couldn't agree on a decision. What we agreed on was an accord, and we took note of the Copenhagen Accord. And this was because countries thought that there was no transparency, because this was sort of decided by few countries, and the African continent was led by the late Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And I must admit, leading to Copenhagen, the African group became more organized, because from Bali, what we set up in terms of negotiating for Africa was a group of negotiators who are the technical, comprising of the focal points, and they are the technicians. And then you have the African ministers of environment through the African Ministers Conference of Environments, and they are the ones that look at the policy issues. And you have a chairperson every year, and they report to the heads of states. And the heads of states agreed that they would be coordinated at that level, headed by a president. So in the lead to Copenhagen, Meles was the voice of the heads of states. And since then, we had this setup. And the Committee of Heads of States on Climate Change is called the CAHOS. So the fast start financing came, which helped countries, the developed countries committed to the 30 billion, fast start within 3 years. And then in Cancun, we agreed on the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, where it became, we agreed on it, but it became operational in Durban. And in Durban, that was also another turning point, because it was in Durban, in COP17, where we agreed that we would have both developed and developing countries taking commitments through a legal agreement that would be decided in Paris. The Green Climate Fund was established, and it was also in Durban that the African lead negotiators, African group, introduced an adaptation goal for the negotiations. And in Durban, we established what was called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, that called for a legally binding agreement in Paris by 2015, through which all would commit to reducing emissions to below 2 degrees, and also looking forward to pursuing a 1.5 degree goal. And this was also pushed by the small island developing states through the umbrella of AOCs. So Durban was quite key. And from Durban, we moved to, of course, we went to Doha, and then finally to Paris, where we agreed on the Paris Agreement. I must say, after Doha, also a transition committee, even in Cancun, a transition committee was established to look into the operationalization of the Green Climate Fund. And there was some agreement also to have a standing committee that would have oversight on the implementation of the Green Climate Fund in terms of operational guidance, to providing guidance to the COP, because the Green Climate Fund would be under the guidance of the COP, and then a board was established to have oversight on policy decisions of the fund. Let me also state that before Copenhagen, in the process we had the Kyoto Protocol, where there was a 2% levy, because we had the CDM, and there was a 2% levy, which would go towards mobilizing resources for adaptation. And in the lead to Copenhagen, we agreed to establish an adaptation fund. We could recall that during the course of the convention, the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, was the operational entity of the financial mechanism of the convention that supported the implementation of the convention through providing resources to parties, to national communication, and they were also responsible for the least developed country fund and this special climate fund. So, but when the adaptation fund was established, the developing countries felt the need for equal representation and having a voice in the affairs of the fund, because since the levy, the 2% levy, was coming from the CDM, and the CDM was operated in developing countries, they felt they need a voice. So when the Green Climate Fund was established, in terms of the governance, they also mirrored the Adaptation Fund, because in the Adaptation Fund governance, we had equal representation of the developed and the developing countries in terms of the composition of the board. when we were negotiating also for the Green Climate Fund governance, we mirrored the governance of the Adaptation Fund. So in the Green Climate Fund, the board comprises of 12 members from developed countries and also 12 members from developing countries. So it's a 24-member board that would sort of govern the policy aspect of the fund. Now, I must admit that currently, at some point, there were some challenges in terms of governance, but it was quite effective. The initial resource mobilization of the Green Climate Fund was 10 billion US dollars. And as of today, we went after the initial resource mobilization, we went in for a pledging of additional resources in 2019. And we had additional pledges of 10.3 billion US dollars. But in the initial resource mobilization, the US pledged 3 billion US dollars. And the fund received 1 billion during the Obama administration when there was a change of government. The next government withdrew sort of a commitment from the Green Climate Fund. So the 2 billion we didn't receive. But hopefully with this current government, we hopeful that that would be provided to the fund. Now, in terms of operation, the fund is meant to provide support to developing countries to meet their low emission climate resilient development pathways, aligning it with the Paris Agreement. And as of today, we have committed almost 8.8 billion US dollars. And in our operational modalities as part of the governing instruments, priority is given to 3 categories of developing countries: small island developing states, Africa, and the least developed countries. And we have a balance in terms of operations between mitigation and adaptation, 50-50 balance. And out of the adaptation commitment, 50% of the adaptation resources should be dedicated to least developed countries, Africa, and small island developing states. So I must say that currently we have more than 170 projects, that almost 177 projects that are under implementation. And Africa, out of the 8.8 billion US dollars, Africa has 38% of that portfolio. So it's not a small share of the fund. Although we know the resources are inadequate, the challenges are enormous, and I think the latest IPCC report did reflect that situation, that impacts are being felt. We are yet to meet our goal with the commitments that we have currently on the table. Countries are in the process of updating their NDCs to sort of ramp up commitments that would gear towards meeting the -2 degrees goal, and if not the -1.5, because currently the global emissions, the Earth is almost 1 degree warming compared to 1990 levels. So in summary, the fund is providing support to developing countries in terms of mobilizing resources for meeting their emission reduction targets. And we are investing in livelihoods, we are investing. Adaptation per se is looking at the livelihood of countries, looking at how we can enhance the capacity of countries, both human, technical, and institutional capacity, And we have seed money, which is the Readiness Preparatory Support Program, which is grant financing through which we strengthen the capacity of the countries for them to access the fund. And we operate through what we call accredited entities. Some of them are national institutions, multilateral development banks, private sector, civil society organizations that would be implementing our projects and programs on behalf of the countries. And we operate through what we call national designated authorities or focal points. So they are the interface between the fund and the countries. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions that would arise. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Pa, for giving us the historical overview and of some of the struggles and some of the complexities of getting African priorities heard in these negotiations for 3 decades now, and trying to highlight some of the issues and then tying that to the very concrete work that the Green Climate Fund is doing. Now, I want to hand it over to Kamisa for her opening remarks and her thoughts on how to navigate this space politically as African states, as African decision makers, and how one tries to highlight some of these priorities. Over to you, and thank you once again also for being with us, because I know you're traveling.
Thank you so much, Harry. So let me thank you for putting this event together, and let me thank Columbia University for taking this issue of climate change seriously as we're getting closer to COP26, where the world will gather to discuss climate change and mitigation strategies. I think this event is quite timely. So maybe before getting into the debate around climate change diplomacy and what African states should do to make sure that their climate change priorities are right, I think we need to look at the nexus between climate change and development in Africa. I think when looking at climate change and its impacts, it's, I think, fair to say that climate shocks do threaten to derail Africa's development gains. If you look at the Global Climate Risk Index, it does state that that 5 out of the top 10 countries most affected by climate change in 2019 were in Africa. And if my memory serves me right, I believe the top 2 African countries are Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Looking at some figures that I think all of us do have access to, but I think it's important in the framework of this discussion to remind us of the type of impact and harsh impact that climate change does have on African economies. It's looking at the figures that the African Development Bank recently put out that forecasts that climate change could cost the continent $50 billion each year by 2040, and could even lower GDP by up to 3% per year by 2050, which means that Africa's economy would be around 40% the size of what it could have been. I think it's also good to look at why African countries are so vulnerable to climate change. This is definitely linked to a very high dependence on agricultural activities and probably scarcity of alternative income earning activities. Although populations have over centuries developed coping strategies and adapted livelihoods to the region's climate constraints, like nomadic pastoralism in the Sahel region and elsewhere, development processes are really accompanied by changes to ways of life. Personally, over the past few years, I've looked also at the security climate change debate, especially in the Sahel region, which is really where my expertise lies. And so this security climate change debate is visible in various policy reports and discussions, and these have brought climate change to the realm of international policy making by placing it So climate change as a key threat to state and global stability. At the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, climate change and the impacts of climate change and what we can do to mitigate them is really one of the key areas that we're looking at. We're looking at this issue in a various in a sustainable manner. We have a team working on developing a report on this issue. And we believe that climate change and Africa's development go hand in hand. One cannot be dissociated with the other. We have identified 3 key challenges that need to be addressed to allow Africa to develop as sustainably as possible. And again, like I said, we have a substantive report coming out fairly soon. So the first challenge that we've identified, which is quite important in this question and discussion around climate change and climate diplomacy and lessons learned, is that the global response to the climate emergency actually puts Africa's development at risk, and I can develop later. The second issue is that climate change itself derails African economies. And the third one, which I think is the most important and maybe the one that we should really discuss a little more in this discussion, is that there is a need to develop an effective and efficient partnerships between high-income countries and African governments in addressing the impacts of climate change on African economies, on questions of migration, of human security, and of food security. So I don't want to be too long, but I just wanted to, mention that there is the holistic responses and cross-sectoral collaboration in addressing the impacts of climate change is key. Countries on the African continent and elsewhere must also adopt a multi-hazard and multi-sectoral systemic risk management approach to anticipate, to prevent, and to prepare for and respond to disaster risks and other consequences of climate change. I personally believe that strategies need to integrate not only natural hazards, because this is the visible result of climate change, but there are also biological threats, and such as COVID-19, which is this unprecedented pandemic that we've lived with for over a year now. And so this risk management must be based on an understanding of the systemic nature and interdependencies of risks. Maybe recommendations moving forward. We know that at the next COP26, mitigation strategies against the impact of climate change will be a heavy focus of the event. So partnering with African governments around what they have as their vision for their transformation is key. And at TBI, we were pushing the narrative that high-income countries must bear the greatest responsibility for cutting emissions and financing measures across the globe to adapt to climate change's impacts. Number 2, there is a need to balance the opportunity that Africa's fossil fuel reserves present to drive development and industrialization on the continent and the global need to decarbonize. And number 3, which is an important topic, it's really to meet climate finance obligation that will come in addition to development financing and will not reduce development financing. This is a a new topic. It's a complex one. We have to look at it as a holistic one. Really, again, this event is timely. Mitigation will be at on top of the agenda at the next COP26. And I think there's a lot that can be said about collaboration between high-income countries and the African continent. And again, with when it comes to climate change finance, there is also an issue there that needs to be explored. And I'm glad my co-panelist was able to talk to us about the Green Climate Fund, which is an important initiative in this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamisa, for sharing that with us, and a number of very interesting and indeed provocative points you put out there, which we very much appreciate. Now, let me perhaps ask a question to both of you, because you've both served in ministerial capacity in different African states. African countries, as you've both outlined, are of course overwhelmed with all kinds of both internal and external demands of absolute top priorities and different crises to be addressed. How, from a political perspective, do we both think in the long term in such a context, and indeed try to gear administrative bureaucratic systems for an adequate response? And how do we more effectively get different councils of ministers, different heads of state to prioritize questions of climate? In your respective experiences in two different countries, what are some of the important takeaways from your time there? Perhaps we'll start with you, Pan, and we'll come back to Kamisa.
Thank you for that question. A very important question. I think from a policy perspective, mainstreaming climate change into the various sectors was paramount, and the development of a climate policy, which in some countries also leads to a climate law, a climate legislation. It's key, and in some of the countries you do have, as part of the mainstreaming of climate change, you have also the budgetary process, ensuring that you account for your contribution, because despite the fact that most African countries contributed less to the effect, this is a global effect, and it knows no boundaries. It has no boundaries. So countries are also putting in mechanisms from within their own resources to fight the impacts of climate change. We all know that most of our countries depend on rain-fed agriculture, and in terms of agriculture, it is also subsistent and smallholder. So they are all dependent on climate and climate variabilities for agriculture. So the policies would have to be right. The governance is also very important, because we know in terms of we have challenges of financial resources, we have challenges related to sociocultural aspects, and we also have technology barriers. So putting in place a good governance structure, it's key, and that calls for a political will from the highest to the institutional levels. And you have ministerial councils in some countries. They have established offices under the office, the climate governance under the offices of prime ministers, some under the office of presidents, to really focus on the priority and the impact of climate change. But linking the vulnerability and how to address climate change to the development aspect, it's very key. So you have to ensure that for monitoring the aid effectiveness, all your development priorities are mainstream, and you coordinate the financing, because there is a lot of support that is coming from both development partners and also international multilateral institutions. So putting in place that governance mechanism and the institutional and legal frameworks is fundamental in ensuring that you effectively tackle the impacts of climate change. And this is where you would ensure that there is coordination at institutional level, going all the way to the political level.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Pa. What about you, Kamisa? What are your thoughts on how we get the politics of this right within and indeed the administrative systems within African countries amidst all these competing priorities?
Many competing priorities. And I agree with what Pa Usman just said about the necessity of political will. I mean, that's a given. But I have to say that in most countries I've worked in and with, climate change and environment issues are not on top of the agenda. They are an outlier, and where you would think that it should be a cross-cutting issue, where all government agencies actually have some sort of environment, climate change component to their missions, it's not really the case. In Mali, which is the country I know best, we had a group of experts working at the presidency, working directly with the president on these issues of climate change and environmental protection. And so they would take it on them to actually go to different ministries and making sure that the priorities set out by the president were being followed, and that they were able to report to the president on some of the initiatives that they were taking on the issue of climate change. But again, like you said, there are many other priorities that these governments are dealing with. Climate change is a huge one, but it's an important one, but it's one added onto many others.
Right, and in that light, perhaps we can also turn our attention to the global level. And again, a question to you both. I mean, you've both stressed very much, of course, how unfair it is that Africa is fundamentally having to deal with some of the worst climatic changes that are happening, even though it's been the continent that historically and today has contributed least. But that fundamental message that this is unfair and that therefore the bulk of the commitments should lie on wealthy industrialized countries doesn't seem to be getting us the results that we're hoping for, right? As you outlined, Paulus, for decades we've tried to foreground that, tried to point that out, tried to shame, if you like, richer countries into greater action. That's only very slowly forthcoming. Is it therefore time for a different communication strategy, different public advocacy strategy? Should we keep hammering that nail? What's your sense, Pa, perhaps starting with you as a veteran in these negotiations? What is the kind of language or the kind of public signaling that perhaps could lead to more substantive action on the part of wealthy countries?
Thank you for that question. And I think as countries continue to feel the impacts of climate change, one of the strategies in recent years is the appointment of climate envoys, the special climate envoys, and depending on the commitment and the policy framework at national level, several governments have appointed special climate envoys as part of their lead negotiations in climate change. I must say that climate diplomacy, and I agree with Kamisa that in most of the countries, environment is not a priority and climate change per se, but it has taken another dimension because of the nexus between development and climate. And countries have always been rallying for new and additional resources to ODA. We know that the support that countries provide, the developed countries, in terms of ODA, the climate finance, and we still cannot agree on what is climate finance. in the negotiations, I mean, there is no agreement on climate finance, and even what is adaptation finance. So we would have to continue, and within Africa, as I alluded to earlier on, you have the negotiators who negotiate on behalf of their governments, raising awareness about the impacts of climate change and also calling for more support. And you have the ministerial, and in fact, right now, the African Ministers of Environment, AMSEN, are meeting in Senegal, where the negotiators would present their position, the key asks to the ministers, and the ministers would come to a resolution on agree to forward that to the heads of states. And the heads of states would now take the lead, taking the political mantle at the COP, because several heads of states of Africa would also be in Glasgow. And immediately after the COP, they would assess the outcome of the COP. And you know, the African heads of states meet early in the beginning of the year, sometimes in late January or February. They would assess the outcome of the COP and their strategy. How did they perform during the COP? What were the outcomes that were related to Africa, and how could they move forward? Well, I think countries would need to continue raising their voices, particularly the most vulnerable, the indigenous peoples. We've seen over the years the marginalized, the civil society organizations, the indigenous people, the youth, the African youth are a very strong voice. As you know, the African continent comprises of almost 30% of the youth population, and they are the future. They are the ones who would, if we don't move towards a carbon neutral or decarbonized economy by 2050. What I've also seen is African countries moving towards low carbon and coming up with 2050 targets. But this would require enormous support from the developed countries in terms of finance, capacity, support, and also technology innovations, particularly adaptation technologies, because adaptation has been and would always be the priority for Africa.
Can we say your take on this question of messaging and communication, the importance of having that shape the negotiations?
So I've never participated in any negotiations around climate change. I've witnessed a few heated conversations most of the time. I just wanted to piggyback on what Pat Usman said about what is climate financing. There has been a lot discussed around that issue. I think we should just look at what the UN Conference for Trade and Development put out recently in terms of number, saying that it estimates that import revenues in low income and lower middle income countries will fall by around $6 billion because of the proposed EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I'm sure that Pat Usman knows that mechanism more than me. It's a very complex one, but it does impose or proposes to impose a levy on a specific type of product. So, which means that if we move forward with this narrative that climate change has, clear, how should I say, that we know exactly where climate change comes from. We know that we need to reduce our carbon emission. We need African states to align with what high-income countries will be doing right now. We're just looking at, we need to look at a fair arrangement that will not penalize African countries. And I think, yes, it's about the narrative that we put out. It's about the messaging that we put out. And it's just not fair to penalize African countries when high-income countries have developed their industries based on heavy carbon emissions. And so, yeah, in terms of fairness and making sure that the gap doesn't get bigger between African countries and lower income countries and those high income countries, that we need a fair solution. And yes, there is a narrative that needs to be put out. I do believe that the UN system is well placed to really push that agenda, and it's already doing so. African countries themselves have to also make sure that their agendas are put forward when it comes to climate change and climate narrative. It has to be very clear to all of their partners as to what they're looking at, what they're expecting, the type of assistance that they're also expecting, and the type of, I guess, I don't know if I should use that word, clements from their partners in terms of lenience when it comes to measures to let them develop at their own pace, and while their partners cut down on carbon emission to allow us to live in a better place.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Perhaps turn to the Q&A, and let me please remind our audience that please do send in your questions whenever you feel that there's things you want to contribute and you want to ask to our panelists. But turning perhaps to you, Pap, first, there's two questions I think very specifically addressed to you. One is a question about institutional frameworks in Africa and the linkage between the unfortunately often weak domestic institutional frameworks and the ways in which Africa then approaches climate negotiations. If you could speak a bit to how that relationship has changed, how African positions, so to speak, are developed over time and are fine-tuned, that would be useful. It's a question posed by Anis. And a question posed by Padma, perhaps about some encouraging examples that you've seen, whether in your capacity in the Gambia or elsewhere in the continent, of how African countries are themselves trying to move forward, sometimes in partnership with others, but perhaps themselves trying to take a number of encouraging initiatives that lead the way and by example. For example, I'm thinking here a number of the net zero commitments that have been undertaken, or perhaps some more local examples. So over to you for that, Pal.
Thank you for that question. I think transformational planning and programming it's key, and developing strategies that are aligned with the policy objectives of mainstreaming climate across the sectors, particularly the climate dependent sectors is paramount. And we've seen over the years through the national communication, because through the UN processes, countries are supported to submit their national communications, and through the national communications, you have the focal persons of the countries who develop strategies and action plans, interministerial and also institutional frameworks to address the impacts of climate change. The resources are never adequate. And what we are doing with through the Green Climate Fund is to bring the institutions and strengthen, enhance the planning and the strategy development of the countries, and see how through those plans they can be further supported to operationalize that. So you have the UNFCCC processes, but as an operational entity of the financial mechanism of the convention, we provide support to further enhance the planning processes to see how countries can operationalize their national determined contributions, their NDCs. And due to the COVID, we are also looking at how they can bring in and integrate climate resilient recovery measures into the national determined contributions. So for planning, as Kabisa indicated earlier on, most of the focal point institutions for climate are environment ministries. But we've seen that climate is cross-cutting. It's it's a development challenge, trade issue, and in fact, it's a security issue. So bringing all the stakeholders together, from policy to strategy, is key, because without that, if you have different sectors working in silos, competing for the resources which are not well integrated, well coordinated. So our role is to bring them together, and so that we align all the support that is coming from the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, that is also an operational entity to the financial mechanism and supporting countries in adaptation planning and others. And we support the adaptation planning process because planning is so fundamental. We support the planning, developing the plans, also bringing the coordinating mechanisms and ensuring that there is consistent and coordinated meetings. Because if people don't meet, brainstorm, look at how to operationalize their plans, then nothing will work. And aside from that, you have to monitor and evaluate progress in terms of implementation. So we do provide this kind of support. The resources, of course, are never enough, but we hope the little that we are bringing forward is making a difference, and we're looking forward to additional resources. We hope that the U.S. Congress would agree on the appropriation that it's before them, before the end of the year, for 1.5 billion US dollars. That would also make a difference. Now, in terms of what countries are doing, we have seen countries developing a net carbon strategy. Going, for instance, Gabon is doing quite well, despite the fact that it's an oil producing country. They have a very ambitious climate strategy, and the political will has been there. Gabon is also supporting the African initiative of the African Adaptation Initiative, and they have invested financial resources towards that. We do have the heads of state initiatives in Africa, 3 initiatives, one looking at the Sahel through the Great Green Wall Initiative. We have one in the Congo Basin, which is headed by the president of Congo, Sassou Nguesso. They have established what they call a blue fund. As we know, the Congo Basin is a big sink and contributes a lot towards reducing emissions because of the forests in that area. So we also trying to see how we can support those initiatives. So you have Ethiopia, which has a very ambitious climate strategy, and Senegal, a lot of hosts of them, that Kenya, Malawi. I mean, if I start naming, I might be mistaken, but they are really taking the lead despite the fact that they have limited resources. But one would also need to factor the fact that we have the discovery of oil in most of these African countries, and if we want them to go through a low carbon pathway, we would sort of constrain them, because we are not giving them the development space. Because we know that we need to give them space to develop and make use of their natural resources. But with additional resources, more financing, maybe they can still tap in these resources in a more sustainable way. But they are asking for support in terms of technology, and I think with support through technology, carbon capture and storage could be utilized through the capturing of some of the carbon that would be emitted during the exploration of oil, and maybe they can go in for alternative sources of energy, or using gas, which is also another alternative compared to burning carbon oil. Thank you.
All right. Well, that last point allows us to pivot to a question that Paul was asking to you specifically, Kamisa, saying, wouldn't any form of clemency from development partners to African economies, in a sense, undercut the ability of African states to leapfrog their economies to these new technologies and to kind of more low carbon forms of energy? In other words, what Pa was just referring to, isn't there a risk, so to speak, if we just relax the rules, that they'll be stuck actually with technologies that are not necessarily wanted in other parts of the world, and that don't give them the kind of dynamism and innovation or innovative capabilities that otherwise they might have? What's your reflection there on Paul's question?
Thank you, Harry. So please allow me to just turn my camera off. My connection is very unstable right now. I think it's a good question that you've just read for me. I think when I talked about clemency, what I had in mind is really to let African economies choose the path that they want to choose in order to develop. I don't think that there should be an imposed way by the international community about what they should do and what they shouldn't do when deciding on what transformation journey they want to take. There are some technological solutions that are being used, even here in Africa. I don't have specific names, but I know for a fact that, for example, Cote d'Ivoire is using a lot of technology to prevent and mitigate climate disasters. And so I don't believe that the use of technology in sub-Saharan Africa specifically is going to be to the point where carbon emission will have to disappear. But I think there has to be a smart mix between the two that has to be done. And I just believe that international partners, the international community, the UN system should really be I think the word clemency keeps coming back to mind, but it should be easier on African countries than on any other ones.
Right, and perhaps on that team, Pat, there's another question I want to tie just to Kamisa's last point. It's a question by Theo in the Q&A, asking you indeed about African priorities at COP26. Is there any surprises, any new things that are become particularly important for them to highlight or to explore, also perhaps in the context of the linkage with the COVID crisis and the way that has brought to the fore some of the inequalities, the inequities that both of you have been talking about? How do you see that? I mean, you'll obviously not be there as an African negotiator in this case yourself, but how do you see the position that your colleagues are going to be taking and the strategy they may put forward?
Thank you for that question. And I think Africa has a very strong voice in the negotiations, and they would be coming up with various asks. From an adaptation perspective, they are looking at the adaptation goal and how it could be measured, how really to have some metrics of measuring and really monitoring the achievement towards meeting the adaptation goal. That is one aspect, because this was their initiative and they're championing it. They want to see, and it's in line with the vulnerability of the continent and adaptation being priority for the country, for the continent. So the metrics, it's key, but it has to be measured in terms of impact and also the volume of resources in quantifiable terms to the continent. And then capacity development, strengthening of institutions. With respect to the GCF, they would still ask for direct access, for the enhancing direct access to the continent, because we have two modalities of access to GCF resources through our accredited entities. One is through multilateral and some bilateral institutions, international ones, but also through direct access, which is institutions, national institutions, and regional institutions. So they would be asking for more of that, because the portfolio, if you look at our portfolio for Africa, I think we have more than 70 to 75% of GCF resources going to the international accredited entities. So they would ask for that. Technology is key. As Kabisa said, appropriate technology is fundamental, and also looking at indigenous technology and using indigenous knowledge. What we are supporting through the GCF and also the GEF is the assessment, technology needs assessment. So countries would assess their technology needs and then move on to developing a technology action plan. So these are processes of really looking at assessing, developing action plans, but the fundamental one is operationalize the action plan. And this is where finance is. So finance would be one. And the issues of really ensuring that impact is being felt on the ground. Because we talk of these figures, billions of dollars going to Africa from both the GCF, and for the GCF, out of the 8.8 billion US dollars, 3.3 in our portfolio is for Africa. But how is this impacting? How is this being realized on the ground is also important. So the verification, measuring this impact is important. Capacity issues, how are we supporting them? And I think one important thing also is really aligning the African Union 2063 vision with the sub-regional and the national strategies is also important, because support is coming from all ends. At the continental level, they are receiving support, looking at policies, trying to see how they can support the continent, aligning it with the goal, which has to be in alignment with most of the multilateral agreements that the continent agreed on, and hopefully they would come up with the complementarities and coherence between the MEEs, the Climate Convention, the biodiversity, and also the desertification conventions, because they all impacting and affecting Africa quite immensely. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. There's another question there, which deals specifically with youth. Many of these big conferences, these big summits, there's often small, sometimes token youth delegations, but of course, getting the voices heard of young people all around the world, but specifically of African youngsters is very hard. It's something that many decision makers don't always seem terribly keen to actually engage with beyond paying lip service. Karissa, perhaps turning to you, how can we hear those voices and give them a more prominent place beyond indeed this kind of tokenism or these kind of one-line engagements, this kind of lip service that we often see, especially keeping in mind that this is the youngest continent in the world, that in many African countries, the median age is around the age of 20, meaning, of course, that these are people who are being saddled with the extraordinary burden of the past, as well as with intensifying challenges going forward into the future, because this seems a key, not only justice issue, but a key political, social question that must be addressed. What are your thoughts on that score?
So first of all, African youth have been involved with climate change issues for over a decade now. There is this African Youth Initiative on climate that was launched, I believe, in 2005 or 2006 in Nairobi, Kenya. And since then, the network has grown and gained momentum. It's now the leading youth movement on climate change and sustainable development in Africa. And they have over 20,000 members in about 45 countries. But I think the central question here is really, why does the African youth actually matter in the global environmental discourse? The year 2020 has seen the world to grapple with this unprecedented global pandemic, as the climate crisis is another one added to that. And the impact of this issue of climate change is being felt across the African continent, but most specifically by what we commonly call the vulnerable groups, which are women, children, and youth. And many parts of Africa have suffered extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, etc., which disrupt lives and livelihoods. And like you said, Africa has the world's youngest countries, but there are youth voices that are increasingly getting interested and getting a seat at the table when it comes to discussions around climate change. The African Youth Initiatives on climate, which I just mentioned, is recognized as a strong constituency for youth in Africa by many international organizations. I know that they have recently actually acquired observer status at the African Union, I believe. They have a strong partnership with UNECA, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and the UN Environment Program. So it does really work to promote the effective participation of African youth in international debates and initiatives on climate change. And so, I believe that they have a lot on their plate to make sure that youth voices are included. And when discussing this issue of policy of climate change, it wouldn't make any sense to put the youth aside. They should be part of the discussion, because the climate change disruption will affect them first in the next few years.
Thank you very much. And as you said, actually, that's a hopeful message indeed of that inclusion does not have to be seen as just remedying a problem, but actually as a source of new ideas and new input. Paul, there's another question for you here in the Q&A, specifically because you made reference to this, to indigenous and local knowledge. How do we harness that? How do we also make sure that that is not necessarily exploited sometimes by external actors? There's a long track record of that, of course, in parts of the world like South America, for instance, and biopiracy is a big issue in global environmental discussion. So how do we share and incorporate and prioritize that knowledge without it necessarily then being appropriated by other external actors, for example, for profit? That's the question by Martha.
Thank you. I think the role of indigenous people and communities is very vital. We ensure that their rights are not infringed on, and there is consultation from the beginning of the design of any proposal that comes to the GCF per se, and this is very important. in our environment and social safeguard policies. We ensure that one, they are consulted, two, they agree to, and their rights and the knowledge is also important. And in terms of the rights, we don't have an indigenous peoples like a policy right per se, intellectual property right policy at the fund. But what we always advocate for is to ensure that the countries have access to all the knowledge, and they would be the ones that would be the final custodians of the knowledge from the support that we provide. So initially, when we start implementing our programs, all the assets and the knowledge would be coordinated by the accredited entity, but at the end of the program, everything is handed over to the country. So we ensure that at least that intellectual property remains with the communities and the governments. But we are yet to have a policy on that. But the rights of the indigenous people is critical. And in all our programs and projects, we would have to ensure that that consultation is there, it's documented, and it's disclosed. We have this disclosure policy where we disclose all this on our website. And the indigenous people are also part of the CSOs that really scrutinize our proposals. Before any approval of GSEF projects, they would submit their comments to the board, and they would deliberate, first of all, because they also have their network. So based on the proposals that will be coming to the board, they do their own investigations and then submit their observations. And we always, the board is very cognizant of that, and they always want to take their concerns on board. I think if you recall, there's few board meetings where some proposals were rejected because of concerns coming from civil society organizations. And in some instances, their proposals are reflected as part of the conditions precedent upon approval of the funding proposal before it becomes effective.
All right, just looking at the clock here, I think our time is pretty much up. Perhaps a very short final question to each of you, getting your thoughts. When will Glasgow have been useful or successful for the African continent? If you could just share your very final thoughts with that. Perhaps I'll start with you, Kamisha, to give a minute to catch his breath, and final reflections you'd like to share on that.
Sure. I think if out of Glasgow, African countries come out with a unified narrative about what they want to see from industrialized countries when it comes to policy that would not penalize their industrialization. I would think that the Glasgow event would be a success. Again, I think there is a pretty good chance that the Glasgow event will focus on mitigation capabilities when it comes to climate disasters. And I believe that African countries do have a lot to offer when it comes to mitigation strategies. But again, I think if African countries are able to come out of Glasgow with a unified narrative about what they want to fight for when it comes to climate change policy, Glasgow would be a success. And I think this is, yeah, this is a perfect conclusion to this very important discussion that we've had today. And I would like to thank you and Columbia University for putting it together.
You're most welcome, Kamisa. You're most welcome. Pap.
Thank you. First of all, Africa will be going to Glasgow with a unified voice. As I indicated, the African group of negotiators do work together, and they have a common position. They always have a common position, which is presented to the African Ministers of Environment. As of now, the Ministers of Environment are discussing those issues, which would be forwarded to the heads of states, and Gabon would be heading the heads of states that would be going to Glasgow as a team. So everything would be guided by their common position, which is the African platform. The expectation in Glasgow, I think, first of all, due to the COVID pandemic, there needs to be equal and balanced representation of the African delegation from across the continent. And I think all efforts will be made to ensure that the African delegations are not constrained, particularly the youth and the gender. Civil society organizations also participating. I said finance is key, adaptation for Africa is key, technology is key, but in essence, what they also look for is a balance between the various negotiation streams. There are issues that are very key to Africa, but there are also issues that are interlinked and related to other developing countries that Africa would support in solidarity with the rest of developing countries, because it has always been like that. Africa has a common position and they fight for it, but at the end of the day, when they go to the bigger group of 77 and China, they also ensure that their points are put across and they have a unified position that would be one that they can take against the developed countries. But climate change knows no boundaries. And I think at the end of the day, all would be negotiating on behalf of the future generation, of course, taking into consideration the regional, national, and sub-regional perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Paran. Again, thank you so much, Kamisa, for your input and the very rich overview. Again, you've given us both the historical nature of some of these struggles and how long and hard African negotiators have had to fight for some of these points and still are having to struggle for some of them, but also on some of the perspectives on how, as you said, to achieve a kind of more balanced outcome that doesn't undercut Africa's ability to develop and to make choices of its own, but to do so in partnership with the rest of the world, which recognizes the historical responsibility it owes to African states. So thank you so much for that. We'll have another event in this series coming up, not too distant future, focused specifically on the challenge of climate change, security and development in the Sahel region. Please stay tuned for announcements speaking to that. We'll also have another session specifically focused on adaptation. What exactly do we understand by adaptation? What are different ways of thinking about it and implementing, concretizing it in different African contexts? But for now, thank you so much. Thank you so much for those people who asked questions in the Q&A and for those calling in, listening in around the world. Thank you so much from the Center on Global Energy Policy and the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia University. And I wish you a most wonderful day or evening wherever you may find yourselves. So thank you so much, and hope to see you again. Soon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you.